Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Sasha, and it's just an honour and a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today. Let's start, before I read my paper, shall we have a go at the manifesto that you've got on handout? It might just be nice to read that, and then we'll have it in the air, and you can have it. You'll see you've got a choice of la poésie present interluminal. I'll leave it up to you which line you read. If we just go around the room and everybody takes a line from either side or both, I'll start with present internuminal, and then if you can read the next.
Poetry does not serve any more for needs.
Depuis 4000 ans, elle a servi à remplir l'espace à lui de colonne.
Depuis Homère et ce qu'il supporte les Virgiles, jusqu'à Racine, Molière, Shakespeare, Goethe, Hugo, elle a servi à ranimer les grands vies par un imaginaire héroïque et un langage métaphorique.
Poetry of the present has given up the Asiano-Mediterranean archetypes. It has given up the eros.
Poetry of the present has found a new objectivity of things in the living space.
Can we go back? Can we go back there, please?
I don't have that. Where are we?
Poetry of the present was the last.
Verbal?
So it is now, it does not.
It does not seek anymore to explicate phenomena, be they social or false philosophical.
Poetry of the present does not spring out of faith, it has liberated itself of the world agony and the ridiculously tragic keeping up with the cunning of struggle for equal.
Poetry of the present understands its objects, the words, as agents of our living space.
It gives back to the words, and by the words, the correspondences of the things before and outside the social and eugenic needs.
Le son poétique, non musical, crée des dimensions complexes, fonctionnelles, temporelles et numériques. Il fait voir par ses interrelations la coïncidence oppositoire des choses par leur propre valeur.
These values are nowhere of social classes nor of historical aspect.
La poésie du présent est en dehors de l'historique restreint, de l'utilité froussarde anthropophage et anthropomorphe.
La poésie présente vise la vie relative des fonctions indomptées et non classifiées.
Present poetry is neither for nor against, neither classic nor romantic nor surrealistic.
La poésie présente vise la vie relevante des fonctions indomptées et non classifiées.
Are you ready? Where are we now? Because I lost track. Poetry intervenes now. Presence is new.
I think we missed a few lines out there, but that's what reading is also difficult and unperfected. Sometimes I get a class to read both versions out at the same time, but we'll leave it at that for now. So I'm here to talk about my experiments in avant-garde poetry and pedagogy, and the best way I think to do that is to get you to join in. So I will read my paper to you, and meanwhile, please would you write down, take a scrap of this paper each, in big legible letters, your favourite agents of our living space, i.e. a single phoneme, a word or phrase, a poetic line, a sentence or other brief unit of semantic yield on this piece of paper. And you can take it from Pin, or you can take it from any of your favourite avant-garde texts. Just a small utterance, any utterance, and write it down there. And add to it as you're listening to what I have to say and then how the conversation goes, any key word or term that appeals to you, that you just like the sound of or resonates with you. So keep that piece of paper, and then we're going to make a nice collage poem at the end with these utterances. If you're stuck for things to write on your bit of paper and you can't bring to mind any other avant-garde text or whatever, then look about your person for some discourse, either in your pockets, on your t-shirt, and you know, I myself, I'm wearing a t-shirt today, so this might go in with it. Protect the dolls, but I'm sure some of you have bits of language or icons on your garments, so you know, throw that into the mix. Okay, so we've just got little scraps of paper with words that we can then orchestrate. Okay, that gives you, it's like a kind of form of seminar bingo, but let's bear that in mind. So my paper's in 3 parts. The first part is about Pin. The second part is on otium, this idea of pleasure and leisure, idleness, not working for the state, whatever you want to call it, it's a classical term, otium. So we're going to go Pin, otium, and then I'm going to give you a little tour of some of my pedagogy. So where are we? I've got, let me just, that's 9 instructions to you. So we're on the slide, that is my here. Oh yeah, no, I needed to show you these. In this poetry book I've got here, this is my first collection of poems. It's called Sex Phrastics, which, as you can see from the title, is about queering and gendering the act of ekphrasis. In it is a ritual for the poet CAConrad, and this is an example of the kind of seminar ritual that sometimes we do. I did this with Colin Hurd. It's called Ice, Pigment, Glitter and Turmeric, Jasmine, Fire. And it involves taking a poem from CAConrad's book, which I've got here to share with you, reading it out in class, getting the students to read the poems they've written in response, and then getting them to do all sorts of things with glitter and gloop and candles and colours, soaking them in water, and then taking another set of poems and reading them, and then setting fire to them with turmeric in a bucket, and then bringing them all back together into this huge gloop, following CAConrad's instructions, where CA decided to burn the poems that they didn't want to be published and bathe in the ashes of their own poems, and then out of that experience to make more poems. So that's an example of some of the more adventurous seminar exercises I could have got you to do. But there's nothing to stop you from, you know, taking away these poems afterwards and burning them and then bathing in their ashes with jasmine and making more poems. But I would say that that's in the spirit of both CAConrad and Kurt Schwitters. So my own published thoughts on Pin were in my monograph on 1910 to 1945, Image to Apocalypse. And Since then, I've been working with Cole Collins, who I know at least one of you know, on proposing a new edition of PIN. I gave a version of this part of the paper in Lisbon a couple of years ago, so this is collecting my thoughts from a couple of years ago, and then I'll move into otium and pedagogy from there. So poetry is now présence into new, PIN, poetry intervenes new, poetry intervenes now, presence is new, PIN. The now of Kurt Schwitters and Hausmann's 1946 PIN is elusive and precarious, not only because of the magazine's near stillbirth and its tenuous hold on survival into print nearly 2 decades later in 1962 and again in 1986, but also because this now appears first in the facing and otherwise mainly French version of the manifesto, thereby hurling its readers into the highly unstable but nevertheless material linguistic politics of translation, and a pressing sense of urgency for new forms of international communication. Whereas the key refrains, poetry of the present and present poetry, are systematically equated to la poésie du présent and la poésie présente, it seems now has no satisfactory corresponding word in French. Certainly the play between now and new, and with it the sense of present community in nous, meaning we, is hard to maintain with the usual French word for now, maintenant, whose proximity to a sense of maintenance, preserving traditions, is explored earlier in the manifesto. Poetry of the present does not spring out of fear. It has liberated itself of the world agony and the ridiculously tragic keeping up of the cunning of struggle for eating. The now of PIN has no truck with the ridiculously tragic keeping up that maintenant maintains. Consider too the native German of both authors, significantly not supplied by themselves, but available in a much later posthumous translation of their French and English into Poesie ist nun, Présence into neu. But this is the PIN which is in these dual languages and a new language. When this German edition came out, they decided one thing they would do is translate it entirely into German, which seems rather to defeat the point by making it into this mono language. So that's what I'm referring to there. Okay, but Germanic afterlives aside, I'm asking, is the now of Schwitters and Hausmann's original PIN, is it identical as our now in 2026? Certainly in the UK, the government was paying us, until recently, to open our doors to white refugees from war-torn Europe, while trying to ship off brown refugees to Rwanda. Then there's the food banks for the working and not working poor. What is identifiable to anyone of any era short of nourishment is the pressing now of hunger and, I quote, the cunning of the struggle for eating. It will be diminishing, given the historical context of its conception, a time of world agony, to read off this hunger as merely metaphorical. The cunning use of the French figure of war, ruse du combat, acknowledges physical fights to stave off starvation, experienced by millions during and after the war, as well as settling against art made merely for payment. Yet poetry of the present presents itself, whisking the pain of world agony into pin's pun on the French bread pain, as a gift of liberation from fear and hunger. Schwitters himself was living in penury in England after his internment in 1940 as a German alien on fleeing Nazi-occupied Norway. I'm proud to say that he arrived in Edinburgh, where I live, when he fled Norway. But he ended up in an internment camp down south. In his last 2 years, his only income was from the sale of landscape paintings, still lifes, and portraits, conventional works of no resemblance to the avant-garde assemblages that had made him internationally famous between the wars. He was reduced to entering works in flower painting section of the local Ambleside flower show for the prize money. Recognition and some financial support from the Museum of Modern Art in New York came in June 1947, enabling him to focus on making his third Märzbau in the 6 months before his untimely death at 60 in January 1948. These former Berlin Dadaists, Schwitters, Merz and Hausmann Dadasoff, separately exiled in the Lake District, England, and in Limoges, France, both in post-war shock and poverty, still in a struggle for eating, as the poem says, shared by the populations of post-war Europe. They found each other by letter in 1946. Out of their renewed correspondence, they conceived a thing of fantasy to be called Schwittmail, or Pinhole Mail, to be published in Paris in 4 languages. Having assembled the fragile draft of the first pin by the spring of 1947, they failed to secure a publisher by the time of Schwitter's death the following year. Pin, nevertheless, inaugurates a new now, declaring present a future yet to happen. In a typographical design that threatens to vanish into its own pinhole or point, in the first 2 stanzas, both whisk-shaped like the mushroom cloud of an atomic bomb, bouncing on a pin, both in, sorry, we should really go back to that one, both in French and English versions, there is a self-conscious historical bleakness to the recognition in the very war, creative whiskey is fallen very dry, and a matching sparsity to world needs new tendencies in poeting and painting. The new tendencies in this primary world are posited in a newly altered realm of poeting and painting, post-apocalyptic neologisms, perhaps, for pre-war avant-gardes breaking down of generic aesthetic boundaries. These are now superseded by our fantic drizzles and roulequois that overwhelm modern poetry, their new taste. That overwhelm modern poetry by their new taste. Not themselves early adopters of the term modernist, such as John Middleton Murray or John Crowe Ransom or Laura Riding and Robert Graves, by their recourse to the term modern poetry, are Schwitters and Hausmann, each with a distinct stance of his own, Merz, Dadasoff, nevertheless disavowing what has been termed modernist. Who is speaking the words modern poetry that Schwitters and Hausmann distance in quotation marks as a term, that's back to this, as a term already spoken and indeed passé. Modern poetry is passé, and it's certainly not their modern poetry. Poetry of the present and its ever-present alternative, present poetry, and their neighbouring French locutions, in the unfixed form of our phantic drizzles and reliquoirs, nos drizzles et reliquoirs fantômes, do not simply replace modern poetry, but in their proliferating pluralities, they overwhelm poetry. They overwhelm modern poetry in quotation marks. Now, phantic, P-H-A-N-T-I-C, phantics, is German Schwitters' English translation of Austrian Hausmann's French fantôme with an F. But why not use phantom, an adjective and noun like the French? The English phantic, possibly adjectival here, is an obsolete, rare noun meaning a possessed person. Or in one 1656 source in the Oxford English Dictionary, phantic, with a K at the end, from Fantasia, such as are haunted with vain and eluding visions. Phantic is serendipitously close to antic, etymologically related to antique, yet meaning grotesquely distorted. And to the specialist linguistic term, it's also related to the specialist linguistic term phatic, designating or relating to speech, utterances, etc., that serve to establish or maintain social relationships rather than to impart information, communicate ideas, etc. So phatic communication or phatic communion is speech communication of this kind, also trivial or purely formal verbal contact, the usual kind of conversational fillers, ad-libs, ways of reassuring us that we're in this phatic communion. Doesn't really matter what we're saying, yada yada yada. Phantic describes phantom utterance, like a phantom limb, nevertheless serving vital social function in making and keeping human community. A ghostly present absence exceeding need, yet essential and indispensable. It harbours grotesque antique forms. Now, phatic, which was a term coined by Branislaw Malinowski, was first recorded in the modernist touchstone C.K. Ogden's and I.A. Richards' Meaning of Meaning. I don't know if anybody reads Meaning of Meaning now, but it's the sort of thing that used to appear in Robert Lowell's poetry and things like that, of 1923, Meaning of Meaning. I.A. Richards being the kind of father of close literary analysis, the close reading. So here, a new type of linguistic use, phatic communion, a type of speech in which ties of union are created by mere exchange of words. Phatic communion denotes a quasi-Eucharistic state in which a sacred sense of human community is mystically achieved. But this open space is nevertheless vulnerable to a nemesis state, a closing down into silent complicity with an unspoken or spoken authoritarian status quo. Here, euphemistic public language masks violence and murder. Phatic communion, in this negative, sedating sense, becomes, I quote, the conformity in complicity with its time that robs language of its own vocabulary, as the Austrian avant-gardist Karl Kraus warned in 1912. All art that is not against its time is for it, said Kraus. So here he's anticipating Jürgen Habermas's disquiet at the function of bourgeois art as, I quote, sanctuary for the perhaps merely cerebral satisfaction of those needs which become quasi-illegal in the material life process of bourgeois society. Krauss rails against art placed in the service of consoling. Whereas the phatic may put art in danger of complicity, Pin's phantic recovers, reawakens, or rallies in art a more disruptive, oppositional sense of community. Our phantic drizzles and reliquoirs, likewise re-establish, make new a community previously united in the famous pre-war primal phonetic poetry of Schwitters and Hausmann, not precisely repeated here in this collection, but nevertheless haunting their drizzles and reliquoirs. Aficionados of Schwitters' Sonata of 1922 to 32 would know the provenance of its opening salvo, Fumbo Taza U Pagif Qui E U, in Hausmann's guttural sonic performance of an objet trouvé, a printer's block of sample fonts. They would recognize too drizzles and reliquoirs as new departures from those earlier works. There were just enough such aficionados in Britain a year later to commission 2 Merz poetry, Merz recitals at the London Gallery in March 1947, where Schwitters performed old and new works. Addressing an audience not yet established beyond their failing disparate and exilic selves and a vanishingly small circle of surviving disparate exilic friends, Schwitters and Hausmann urge in the unpublished Pin, give up your human feelings and please go through our fan pin and you will know that it was worthwhile. Pin, the thing of fan. Give up ambivalently calls to relinquish or yield subjectivity, your human feelings, in lines promising and performing transformation into a future new retrospect, merely by reading, going through this slender portal, our fan pin. Now, compare the millenarian Crossing Brooklyn Ferry of 1900 by Walt Whitman, his vehicle crossing time to address or produce you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence. Back to this. But what contract is struck by readers at this new, almost deserted turnstile of the now? The second Pin stanza manifesto, present internuminal in English and La Poésie in the face in French, links poetry's now, its intervention in the present, with a yet-to-materialize future, an event horizon furnished by its very linguistic materiality. The transformative power of words is in their materiality. Poetry of the present understands its objects, the words, as agents of our living space. Entering this whirlpool, a new material present makes possible alternative futures. The Pin manifestos proliferating dual linguistic hospitality is enlarged upon by dual menus. So if you look in the book, you'll see the little menus with the kind of like contents pages. Please do pass that round. That's the German edition. You'll see the menus that are billing what they call brain openers. So these are playful contents pages resembling in layout and centered typography restaurant menus. Likewise, they promise nourishment to those in the struggle for eating, and give Schwitters instructions also on how to read sound poems, differentiating German, English, Norwegian sounds and Hausmann, and it also includes Hausmann's phonetic declaration on the interplay of written and voiced utterances. Oh, I don't think I've got that, but it is, you shall make spell phones, you shall make them interlinguistic, you shall sing them like liturgies. So, while poetry of the present has found the new objectivity of things in the living space, past works are reviled as instrumentalist. Poetry does not serve any more for needs. Since 4,000 years, it has served feudal archetypes. Indicted here are poets, Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Virgil, till Racine, Molière, Shakespeare, Goethe and Hugo. Poets whose work served, I quote, to revive the great emptiness by a heroic imaginary in a metaphoric language. Now, this disavowal of individual talents troubles some Eliotic versions of modernism or modernist tradition, including, as it does, T.S. Eliot's reviled romantic heretics, Goethe and Hugo. Pulling up short of the 19th century's close suggests 20th century poets are not all purveyors of heroic genius supermen or criminals of metaphor. The disavowal of metaphor sits uneasily with definitions of modernism as metaphoric. I'm sure you've probably come across this theory that modernism is metaphor and postmodernism is metonymic or whatever it is. I can never remember. I think that's right, isn't it? David Lodge or somebody like that. Anyway, the very unfixing of metaphor, troubling its traditional deployment, its image fixation, its caressing of nouns, rather, is among the first heaves of this new poetics. The glitteringly mobile phonetic tesserae of Pin's Poetics resist at a subsyntactic level fixed lexical units. Never mind the other set pieces of the classical and romantic tradition in imperialist deployment of absolute mythic universal subjects and a fixed metaphor. Declaring poetry of the present has given up the Asiano-Mediterranean archetypes, it has given up the heroes, in capital letters, furthermore. Pin indicts the dominant strand of Western poetics as complicit in the rise of the all too recently defeated Nazi and fascist imaginary. Not only is the wholesale slide into daily bureaucratic rationalising euphemisms judged fascist, the mundane atrocities against language in tandem with butchery, literature too stands accused of conformity and complicity with its time. The linguistic treacheries accompanying the industrial-scale genocide of the Nazis, so narrowly escaped by the authors themselves, are opposed by Pin's poetry of the present that gives back to the words, and I quote, by the words, the correspondences of the things before and outside their social and eugenic needs. Celebrating language's materiality is here restorative justice, countering the instrumental discourses of fascist eugenics dominating public language. In December 1946, And I think this is really key for reading that word eugenics in this poem. When Hausmann and Schwitters signed the PIN manifesto, the world's press was daily reporting Nuremberg's doctors' trial, which charged 23 Nazi doctors with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. So the social application of eugenics in the Nazi medical implementation of the euthanasia program is the stuff of that trial's numerous affidavits and underpins the social and eugenic needs cited in PIN. The historical limits of the trial itself raise interesting questions too about periodization, and we're living with the consequences of that periodization now. For, according to historian Gotzali, lawyers who prosecuted Nazi criminals were forced to begin with 1933 and end with 1945. And he says, historical research cannot do this, for the criminals continued to act both before and after these dates. Though forced after 1945 to sublimate the murderous side of their frantic desire for change, they held to their research hypotheses and reformist ambitions, research and progress based on destruction. That's Ali. Now, Schwitters fled Nazi Germany for Norway in 1937, not long before the unnatural death rates began rapidly rising in German asylums. The centrally run, I'm quoting Ali again, the centrally run extermination program begun in the summer of 1939 was merely the continuation of an existing practice, with bureaucratic formalities now attached. Starting in 1942, rather than being carried out in special facilities as before, euthanasia was reintegrated into daily asylum routine. Yet the research of Theo Morell, Hitler's personal physician and author of the memorandum Extermination of Worthless Life of 1939, drew on a much earlier questionnaire issued by Ewald, is that E-W-A-L-D? Don't know how to pronounce that. Ewald, Meltzer. So this questionnaire issued by Meltzer to parents of child patients in 1920. So here it is. So this is issued to about 162 people. 1. Would you give your consent in every, this is 1920, would you give your consent in every circumstances to a painless shortening of your child's life after an expert had determined him incurably imbecile? 2. Would you give your consent only if you could no longer care for your child? For example, if you were about to pass away. 3. Would you give your consent only if your child was suffering serious physical and mental anguish? And 4, I love question 4. What is your wife's opinion on questions 1 to 3? So, even more terrifying are the comments in the free box. 73% of 162 returning respondents answered yes to at least one of those questions. Only 10% answered no to all 4. These statistics and accompanying parental comments, which are harrowing, allowed Meltzer to conclude parents, I quote, would like to free themselves and perhaps the child as well from a burden, but they want to do it with a clear conscience. And then Morell is led to conclude for Hitler, Many parents express the following: if you had simply done it and said that our child died from some illness, one could take this into account. We should not think that we cannot, so then Meltzer's saying, we should not think that we cannot undertake beneficial measures without the plaquette of the people, our sovereign. So based on this questionnaire of 162 people, this becomes the report that goes to Hitler, to the Wannsee, and the mass extermination without officially telling the population, because the plaquette is what pleases the people. It's the unsaid, unspoken consent of the people. So the ramifications go beyond historical analysis of Germany in the 1940s, where if numerous German families were prepared to accept the murder of their closest relatives without protest, even without approval and without official knowledge, they could hardly be expected to object to the murder of Jews, Gypsies, Russians and Poles and everybody else that went. Closer to our own now, going back to November 2014, the Deputy Chair of the British Medical Association supports in a personal capacity a change in the law, which we're now seeing in Britain coming to the Lords. Subject to the success of Lord Falconer's private members' bill, offering assisted dying to terminally ill patients deemed mentally capable and likely to have less than 6 months to live. The Scottish Parliament since then has, since 2022, has been consulting on a similar bill. Poetry intervenes now, I suggest. Call it a modernist period if you insist. Handcuff it. Go ahead to a particular phase of modernity, or don't if you don't. But the time seems ripe now to reach for our interlinguistic spell phones. Meanwhile, back in 1947, surviving historical avant-garde refugees, Hausmann and Schwitters, separately exiled, impoverished, hungry, desperately seek a publisher for Pym. Rejected by London harbinger of surrealism, E.L.T. Messens, who said that 25 years ago it would have been more up to date, Schwitters is forced to conclude the time is not right for this. His last hope lies with the very institution of art his work contests. His plan becomes to interest an elderly Swede in Pym, an art collector, he says, who likes me and would perhaps buy the manuscript without the rights to publish it. If he agrees, we could share the money. Pace Peter Berger, this commodity transaction, however, for Schwitters means Pym in the future will see the light of day, because when he dies, his collection will go to the Museum of Stockholm. He will have it laid out in a showcase, this collector, and many visitors will see it. And Schwitters says, and perhaps in 1950 or 1960, it will be published. So, although Berger's saying that, the avant-garde gets institutionalized and the museums are mummifying it, I would suggest that this is an example of a museum activating it, and it's not all this kind of doom and gloom about what happens to the avant-garde in such institutions. And indeed, this is actually what happened. Pym was first published in 1962 in the edition I've got here by another refugee, the Polish avant-gardist filmmaker, poet and publisher Stefan Themerson. To say, however, as Reichardt reminds us, that Pym essentially belongs to the spirit of the 20s, the 40s or the 60s would be a mistake, for it belongs to any time when the general state of art can do with a shot in the arm. The time is ripe for a new edition, I'm arguing, of Pym, with contemporary additions and accretions. This new Pym will be a much needed shot in our own now. And this is what Schwitters said. He had imagined that he would give a Merz map. He says, perhaps, I'll make a Merz map to accompany this manuscript we can't get published, and this will help frame the project. But then he has this other thought in this late letter. Perhaps it would still be better to leave out the Merz map so that the form of the manuscript will not be too rigid, and so that we could send him new poems from time to time to add to his collection. So Cole Collins and I are imagining an edition which would do just that, would commission new work and encourage, as Schwitters himself recognises here, not having this kind of final framing of the Merz map. So I would call that a form of kind of queer accretion to Merz, which is completely in its spirit of continuing to build. I'm now going to switch voices and give you a little bit from a paper called Floating Like Flowers on Water, Lyric Activism, Textual Editing, Translation and the Politics of Otium. Now, I wrote these reflections for a symposium on literary activism in New Delhi a couple of years ago. And in this closing section, which is about my pedagogy, it describes my shift at Glasgow University from literary criticism into research by creative practice and creative writing. I still do all the same things, but I teach research by creative practice, and a lot of my literary criticism is informed by creative practice. And vice versa, my textual editing informs my poetics. So, otium, by the way, as I've said, is the Roman word. It's got a venerable history. It's the Roman word for peace and idleness, or doing things not on state time, clock time, paid labour. And I'm interested in Bernard Stiegler's theories of otium and negotium. But I see these things as related, and I see what Schwitters and Hausmann were doing is a form of otium in 1946. So here goes. What's on there? I'll just leave that up because that's quite nice. I won't answer to writer or critic, preferring poet and Woolf person, and certainly I've found my tribes on campus and off campus, and certainly when I ran for 8 years the now legendary 1A, Poetry and Poetics, our flagship first year module until 2018, I made sure most of our tutors were poets, and if they were not when they started, like the students, they were most of them poets by the end of the course. My graduate teaching team included these poets: Callie Gardner, Nat Raha, Leela Matsumoto, Tom Betteridge, Katie Hasty, Callum Roger, Sophie Collins, Nuala Watt, Nikki Melville. They taught poetry in terms of literary theory, literary criticism, and creative practice. And lectures were often given over to readings by invited poets such as Tom Leonard, Peter Manson, J.L. Williams, Colin Hurd, Kai Miller, and the poet tutors themselves, as well as open mic sessions for the students. I now teach the undergraduate honours modules, Creative Writing Poetry, Poetry Mothers, Queer Poems, Queer Poetics, and the M-Lit module I designed with poet Colin Hurd and used to co-teach with poet Maria Sledmere. Poetry Intervenes Now, PIN. diverse queer strategies of making. All with the hefty reading lists in poetry and lit crit and lit theory and many other kinds of media. My pedagogy is based in avant-garde experimental poetics, Dada, Ulipu, ritual, erasure, redaction, aleatory, digital procedures, poets' theatre, site-specific work assemblages, ekphrasis, and sexphrastics. Sexphrastics being the title of my first poetry collection. I had wanted to, and in that, by the way, I have a new version of Schwitters' play Revolution in Revon, updated to, I wanted to perform Revolution of Revon in Hanover Street in Edinburgh, because Revon is Hanover backwards. So there's a new version of that in there. Anyway, I wanted to close by segueing to my poem translations of Catullus, which arose from textual editing, and my discovering citations of snatches of Catullus, Sappho, Ovid, and Tibullus, floating up from the text of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. But now I'm more minded to close after a wee drop of Catullus, because he's going to help us with otium, with samples of work by my students on Poetry, Mothers and Pin. These too, I would argue, are translations of sort, but I want to ask, are they the fruits of otium or negotium? These poems by students, student poets, many so heavily in debt and choosing between heating and eating, while spending more time serving in Tesco or McDonald's or Pizza Hut than they can reading or idling in the library. And I'm reduced to being what I think of as a raw content provider to these units of academic debt. It's sometimes what I think. Yet, in our seminars and workshops, something else is happening here. And 2,000 years ago, Catullus number 51 knows what it is. So here's Catullus 51. He to me is a pure God. You can probably beat all gods, the lad sitting right in your face, watching you and hearing you, you gently laughing, which rips up all the feelings. Out of me, sad fucker, for as soon as I see you, lesbian, nothing is on my tongue, but it stiffens, and a searing fire runs right through me. Both ears ring, themselves deaf, and my eye turns midnight. Otium, Catullus, has done you in. Otium blisses you out. You overdo otium, and it did in kings before you, ruined rich cities. I've resisted Englishing Catullus's otium here, whereas in Ovid's otium, in his Amores 2, line 730, I have Englished as free cunt time. So otium can mean free cunt time. After all, it's his Ovid's Art of Love or Joy of Sex, in which he's employing the word. But what English word would do here in Catullus 51? Peace, idleness, fecklessness, ease, pleasure, sex, looseness, debauchery. Other shades of otium than these are also present, not just energetic love-making, but overzealous poetry-making. Even Ovid called his poems otia, the fruits of otium. Here, I understand Catullus's otium as poetry-making, and poetry-making as criticism, and poetry-making as theory, and poetry-making as textual editing, and poetry-making as translation, all of which are present in this lyric spasm on otium itself. This virtuoso piece of lyric work follows on from and accretes to a carefully worded translation of Sappho 31. So Catullus translates the first part of the poem as his translation of Sappho, and then he appends to that this spasm about otium. And Catullus's reparative coda to Sappho evidences the all-consuming demands of translating, of editing, of theorizing, of criticism, all as poetry itself. And it's surely a comment too on poetry's revolutionary political potential. However we English it, we need to be alive to the political power of otium. It has the capacity to bring down kings, destroy cities. Indeed, the ruling classes for centuries have been troubled at the prospect of the lower orders having too much otium. Soldiers and citizens with too much otium are not merely close to opting out of, rather than merely taking a break from, war and business, neg otium. They may bring it all down, and not simply out of debauched dereliction of duty. They may throw their energies into organising opposition. They may be busy patching all-consuming countercultures. All I'm saying is, brothers, sisters, we don't need that fascist groove thing. All I'm saying is give otium a chance, and of course, free Palestine. Okay, so now let's move on to the pedagogy. So poetry mothers. So I teach the same avant-garde texts and my Virginia Woolf texts and the same theory and criticism. They're all listed on the reading list, but my students make poems instead of boring essays in response. And I found it extremely liberating and actually gets us to a way of thinking that the essay form doesn't. So I'm just going to talk you through, as Sasha wanted me to, some of my pedagogies. So poetry mothers is a noun phrase in a declarative sentence. Taking as axiomatic the work of queer theorist and poet Eve Kosebsky-Sedgwick, Poetry Mothers investigates alternative ways of thinking, reading and writing back through our poetic mother texts in modes of mothering and unmothering. Seminars closely examine three mother works: Audre Lorde's Your Silence Will Not Protect You, Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons, and Emily Dickinson's Envelope Poems, inviting creative critical responses in workshops. Now, all three of those texts, well, one of them, Emily Dickinson's Envelope Poems, they were done in the 19th century and archived and have only just been disseminated in book form in the 21st century. Tender Buttons was published in 1914, Gertrude Stein's radically innovative avant-garde poetry book. It has been massively influential on Poetics ever since, and in 2014 there was a centenary edition where somebody actually did some basic textual editing and went to check. Apparently her amanuensis, Alice B. Toklas, was a bit careless sometimes with the transcription, so there's a corrected edition now. So again, a 21st century. And I start with Audre Lorde's Your Silence Will Not Protect You, which is a collection of essays and poems by Audre Lorde. And again, it's had this renewed life in the 21st century. So to me, they're 21st century texts, but they have this avant-garde provenance. Students also are encouraged to seek out and engage with other mother texts and collaborate, and it's the texts, not the writers, who are the mothers here, and are invited to collaborate in the critiquing and making of new queer mother texts, simultaneously forging a community of poets dedicated to queer making. Each year, 2 guest poets read to the class, including Maggie O'Sullivan, Nat Raha, CAConrad, and Leela Matsumoto. So here, this thing that's up on the slide now, this is a collaborative piece that my 2019's Poetry Mothers class made in response to Dickinson's envelope poems. These are poems in Dickinson's archive that she penciled onto scraps and fragments of used mail envelopes. She carefully slit them open in various shapes, then fitted the words of each poem to the morphology of the envelope. So the substrate for Dickinson is really important in shaping the poem. And it's important also to understand with Emily Dickinson's facsicles, as well as her envelope poems, that these are not drafts for publication. These are the thing in themselves. This is what she's making. So these aren't a draft towards something. And this is, of course, where textual editing has done such a violence to Emily Dickinson's work. So it's particularly these envelope poems that I'm interested in getting students to look at. So these 52 works, which are objects spanning poetry and visual art, were published for the first time in colour facsimile edition, The Gorgeous Nothings. And they've gone to great care to curate it so that the other side of the page, it's almost like you could cut them out if you wanted, so that they match the size. I mean, it's the best thing you can do in a two-dimensional page to get a feeling of the envelope, but clearly they're not the same as the actual envelopes. Some poets in my classes used mail envelopes. Others, I just said, bring in anything you consider an envelope. Others chose other objects they understood as envelopes, including packaging for HIV PrEP and packaging for contraceptives, an antidepressant container, an orange peel, and most movingly, a binder vest. So that's what you can see, the binder vest underneath. They collaborated in arranging them as you see, and then we had a collective reading from that body of work. And we learned a lot from editing as well, by where you placed your envelope poem in relation to the poems that were already on the table. And then what I'm showing you here is just one configuration of the edited poem. So I then got them to read the poem from this body of that they'd assembled, this assemblage on the table. So I'll just read you three of them. This is Orange Peel Envelope Poem by Audrey Q. Kendall. Rot, sweet baby, parturition from sweet membrane, no way to be opened, but torn. This is a window pane envelope poem by Rosa Cass Simpson. So these people are like 21 years old, they're in their final year at university. Window pane envelope poem by Rosa Cass Simpson. I love your open hole, pinkish shell. Let me hide clear wrapper between your folds, caressed in thick skin, spread my pale red out, cut the lining on the line, deliver each edge, make soft and smooth, open where I fall out. And the third poem, Binder Envelope Poem by Nikki Benson. Bloom, pop, The restriction is learned young. My grandmother was told love was crinkled safety, crumpled away. 3 years old in a tenancy. Hushed voices simmer like seeds in March. If her baby bird voice cried loud enough to unravel the paint, someone would consider coming. Her father's broad shoulders hunched over, tired. Her Kashka-fed family, tired. Kashkas are raw, old-world grain, whole, unopened barley blossoms, loud and salty. Nothing like buttered popcorn, flashy, unfilling, explosive, burst like anger when quiet goes stale. So will we. I fear I know I am not. I look just like her. This doesn't hide it, the baby bird voice. And she appends the poem with a note. My poem envelops my body. I feel that my need for it to not take up space and be known must in fact do both. And here's the MLIT PIN module. Here's a work, Poetry Interviews Now PIN. So the set text is this. I basically scan it for them. So that's the first thing they read, and then they read 21st century poetry, J. Bernard's Surge, CAConrad's Amanda Paradise, Leela Matsumoto, Two Twin Pipes, About Water, Nikki Walshiger, Crawl Space, and then a selection of pamphlets. And this is for the MLIT, and then they have to make a pamphlet in response to this reading. And it's very much, it's Poetry Interviews Now, so we do site-specific work. We take them to places in Glasgow, send them into a gallery, do rituals with them. Very much that kind of idea of presence. And this is one of the pamphlets that was made. I really like it, Ooze, because we've got Surge, which is one of the titles of the poems on the poetry collections on the course, and the course is called PIN. So we've got PIN, Surge, and Ooze, which I love. So that's my life now. Poetry Interviews Now. So that's the end of my formal part of the course.